The reason why housing prices have spiked, why food affordability has spiked, why affordability on every front has spiked, is just because if you have too many people chasing too few jobs, too few homes, and too little employment, you're just going to end up causing problems. So the federal government blew it. And it's such a tragedy.
Mark Carney is spending money like Trudeau never left. The debt keeps climbing, the policies stay the same, and Alberta, once again, is treated as an afterthought. But this time, the warning signs aren't being ignored. Alberta's premier is launching a new panel asking whether the province should take back control of immigration, policing, pensions, and maybe even more. Because if Ottawa won't change course, Alberta just might have to chart its own. I sat down with Premier Danielle Smith to talk about what comes next and what happens if the country can't be saved. Well, thanks so much for taking the time.
Yeah, my pleasure.
To begin, I asked the Premier about her new Alberta Next panel, a spiritual successor of sorts to the Fair Deal panel. But this time, she insisted the stakes were higher and the clock was ticking.
The last time we did something similar was under my predecessor, and it was the Fair Deal panel, in response to very similar frustrations that we were hearing with a Liberal government that was out of touch, passing policies that were harming our province. And I think that there was a lot of disappointment at the result of this last election, especially since so many of the same people who put in so many of the bad policies got reelected. So I wanted to just take a temperature gauge on where people are at. There were about 25 recommendations that came out of the first process. And so we have a few things that we want to do some specific consultation on. We want to talk about immigration policy and whether we should take more autonomy over that. We want to talk about the Alberta pension plan, if there's an appetite for a referendum there, provincial police, collecting our own income tax, as well as some of the constitutional changes that I know are causing frustration, like the unfair Senate seats, the unfairness in House of Commons seats, and whatever else Albertans decide to put forward. And many of them may be subject to a referendum, which we'll do next year.
So when I heard that you were doing this, I thought, I've seen this movie before, and I think a lot of Albertans sort of thought the same. And I think when they look back at Jason Kenney's panel, they don't see it as a success. There were a lot of recommendations. How many of them were actually followed through on, I guess, is up for debate.
Yeah.
What's different now?
I think that, the passage of time changes circumstances. And I think I interpret it a little bit differently, because I looked at the panel recommendations, and many of them have been guiding principles for our government. If you look at all of the ways in which Albertans asked us to express our own autonomy, we have about 15 different lawsuits that have been launched against the federal government, many of which we're winning on as a result of that process. I think we've changed the entire narrative of the country. If you remember where things were 2.5 years ago when I first got elected, no one would even be talking about major projects. Now everyone's talking about major projects and pipelines. We have done poll after poll shows that the majority of Canadians want pipelines. So that doesn't happen by accident. That happens with dedicated, focused advocacy. And a lot of that direction came from Albertans out of that. We also have changed the discussion on equalization. The very notion that small provinces should pay money into central Canada so that it can be spent in big provinces like Ontario and Quebec is offensive to people. So much so that Newfoundland and Saskatchewan and British Columbia have launched a legal challenge against that. I don't think that would have happened if we hadn't put our referendum forward, even though we didn't get exactly what we wanted. We've changed the conversation. So I'm looking forward to doing the same thing. Let's see if there's some a new take on some of those traditional issues and maybe some new issues that we have to address.
Yeah, there are some.
Yeah.
The entire national zeitgeist on immigration has changed.
It has.
When the Fair Deal panel was happening to now,
Yeah.
there's a completely different opinion on immigration.
Totally true.
And I think maybe, what we've heard from the Alberta government has shifted as well. I think it's fair to say.
You know what? When we started off, I had just gotten elected when the Alberta's Calling campaign had started. And it was important because we'd had quarter after quarter of outmigration. We were some of the first to get rid of the COVID restrictions, and so we were ready to build again and ready to grow again. And it was looking as well like there was increased enthusiasm to invest in the oil and gas sector. So there was a very good reason why we were doing that Alberta's Calling campaign. We were calling to those who were unemployed Canadians in other parts of the country to come to Alberta. What we didn't anticipate was that the federal government was going to completely let off all controls of all streams of immigration at that time. Temporary foreign workers, asylum seekers, international students, as well as the other immigration streams. I think that 1 year period, instead of a normal amount of immigration and newcomers arriving, which would be about 1% of the population, so maybe around 400,000 people a year, they had 1.8 million. And you've seen the result of it. The reason why housing prices have spiked, why food affordability has spiked, why affordability on every front has spiked, is just because if you have too many people chasing too few jobs, too few homes, and too little employment, you're just going to end up causing problems. So the federal government blew it. And it's such a tragedy, because Alberta is probably one of the most welcoming places for newcomers on the entire planet. Our founding story from 1905 was one where we reached out to the world and said, hey, come here and help us build this place. And diaspora after diaspora after diaspora has. And we have one of the most diverse populations here. So people want newcomers. They want them to come here, be Canadian, be Albertan, leave their historic hatreds behind when they leave their home countries. And I think what people are now observing is that it just went too far. And I don't like seeing the fact that the sentiments towards immigration have changed almost 180. I think people want to continue having people who will come here, contribute to the economy, and be able to grow this province, but it's got to be a reasonable level.
What I hear is, I mean, it's, I guess, similar. It's a little different. They want jobs for their children.
Yep.
They want them to be able to go work at the Tim Hortons down the road,
Correct.
like they did when they were a kid. They want to be able to afford groceries. They want to be able to take their kids to the hospital and go through an emergency line when they're having a problem,
Yep.
and be seen within a few hours. And they don't even view that, I think, as, oh, you know, Danielle Smith is not spending enough on healthcare. They think there's too many people in line in front of them.
And I think there's legitimacy to that. It's pretty clear that I think we've had we just surpassed the 5 million person mark. So we've had over 500,000 people come here in the last 5 years. And you just can't build homes fast enough. You can't hire doctors fast enough. You can't build schools fast enough. And so what we're asking for is to have more autonomy and control over immigration. In fact, if you look at the Constitution, Section 95 gives special status to immigration and agriculture, and it's written in a very precise way. It says the provinces shall pass policies in the areas, and from time to time, the Parliament of Canada will too. We flipped it on its head. What has happened is that we've deferred to the federal government on both immigration and agriculture, and they've blown it, and now we have to try to find a way to take back more control. That's similar to how Quebec has. I watched he's a bit of a cuss-mouthed real estate agent, but I do love his TikToks. You can go find him, you know. But he just did one where he said, isn't it interesting that everybody else has had this explosion in housing prices except Quebec? And why is that? And he said, well, Quebec has more control over their own immigration. They get to choose 55% of the newcomers who come to their province. They're now looking to choose 100%. They want to do it under the grounds of culture and language. Well, you know what? We do too. We have a different culture here. We have a different set of priorities here. We want people to come here and be able to flourish, and they can do that if they've got a good paying job to come to, and that they've got the support of a community around them. So that's the kind of thing I think we'll be talking about, is what is the right level of newcomers? How do we take more control so that we have more economic migrants so that they fit in easier? And how do we make sure that we're not getting too many people come here, which is going to then make it difficult for us to provide the social services that everybody enjoys.
With those social services, that's one of the questions, as I'm sure you know, on the Alberta Next panel survey, that there's, you know, they're looking, I guess, they're not saying we're going to do this, but they're looking to see if there's an appetite from Albertans to deny social services to non-approved migrants, which is, I think, what maybe you're alluding to would be in Alberta's control to do. I assume that means healthcare, education. Is that what
Yeah, I mean, you may have seen there's a recent story where there's a group who are trying to persuade us to change our policy. We currently have a policy where you have to be in Canada legitimately in order to receive education services, for instance. And what happens is that when people come here and there's a long process to get approved and then they get denied, they really should be leaving. That's how our system is supposed to work. In Ontario, they've made the decision to allow even undocumented workers to have social programs. And so there's this discussion. We don't right now. And so we want to consult on whether or not that should still be the case. As I understand it as well, that there are certain categories of newcomers where their healthcare has to be paid for by their employer. So we do already have some of those limitations and policies in place. The question would be, do we extend that? Do we say, if we were responsible for choosing all the migrants that come to Alberta, and we set it at a reasonable level, which might be 1% of the population, that'd be about 50,000 people. Anyone else who comes here who doesn't have an Alberta permit, we wouldn't pay for the supports for them, because our program is very different. Our program ensures that somebody who comes here has a job. So they're already coming here as a taxpayer. And if you're coming here as a taxpayer, of course you're entitled to the same benefits as everyone else. What we don't want to do is encourage people to come to Alberta just to take advantage of rich social programs, whether it's daycare or education or healthcare or AISH. We want to make sure that people understand that there's a social contract here, that you have to work to the best of your ability and be a contributor. And we provide a social safety net for those who fall through the cracks. But I don't think Albertans want to be taken advantage of.
And then I turn to the elephant in the room, the recent by-election. In a riding that actually once elected a separatist, the Republican Party finished a distant third, even behind the NDP, in a rural conservative riding. Still, their 17% showing has people asking, could this new, ostensibly right-wing party, led by a leader who many people don't seem to either know or want to vote for, could they split the vote just enough in the next provincial election to put socialist Naheed Nenshi in power? I asked Premier Smith if she'd done the political calculus and if she was worried.
Well, we have always had independence parties on the ballot. I've seen them get as low as, a couple hundred votes, sometimes, 3 or 4 or 5%. This admittedly is the highest percentage that I've seen of a separatist candidate in my time watching politics. I think the one that you mentioned was back in 1982 when Gordon Kessler got elected. And he emerged in this campaign and he was advocating for it again. What I take from that result is that people are unhappy, but they're also willing to give my approach the benefit of the doubt, that let's give this new leader a chance. Let's put the issues on the table. Let's negotiate for a period of time, not too long, and let's try to get a change to those 9 terrible policies, among others, that have held Alberta back. So I feel like this is time limited. I take that sentiment very seriously, and I've told the Prime Minister he should too, because one of the things that they need to understand is that they've created it. This sentiment exists because of how Ottawa has treated our province in particular and some of our industries in particular. They created it because they are passing policy in areas that are our jurisdiction and dictating to us to deliver policy, to deliver different programs in a way that's offside with our values. So this is an Ottawa-created problem, which means it has an Ottawa-created solution. They've got to stop with the terrible policies, back off out of our jurisdiction, and allow Alberta to chart its own course.
But it wasn't just about Alberta. It was about Ottawa as well. I pressed the Premier. How much time will she give Mark Carney to repeal the Trudeau-era anti-Alberta laws, Bill C-48 and C-69, before she considers him to be just more of the same?
I think the fall. I mean, I've been in government now for 2.5 years. We've passed a lot of legislation in 2.5 years, including some pretty landmark legislation within the first 6 weeks of me getting elected. So I know that when you put the pedal to the metal, you can get laws drafted. So they now have a break, and he has until September before he comes back in. So I'll be seeing what kind of accommodations and revisions and revocations he'll be making in the fall. I think it has to be that quick, because it doesn't make sense to say that you're going to create a 2-year to yes window and then dilly-dally for a year or 2 on fixing the underlying legislation that you've just passed a law to do a workaround. I mean, I think that the whole point of the workaround law is because it's a recognition that the other laws have created such a chill on investment that it's unworkable. So I think they could make some meaningful progress on a number of things starting in the fall. And I would hope that they would take that opportunity. I'm a bit disappointed that they haven't even started pre-positioning any of those changes. In fact, the most idiotic one is that would be immediately on our doorstep is the net zero cars mandate. Just when you think about it, Canada, starting on January 1st, 20% of all cars sold are supposed to be net zero. So the hydrogen net zero vehicle industry doesn't really exist yet. The electric net zero vehicles are not produced in that kind of quantity, that 20% of all cars in Canada could be electric vehicles. Alberta alone, we buy 200,000 cars a year. We'd have to buy 40,000 electric vehicles starting in January, which are not produced in Canada, not produced in the US. The only place we could buy them from is China. And yet, because we don't want to buy them from China, we put 100% electric vehicle tax on it. Like, it is this kind of nonsensical pretzel logic that we would like to see some clarity out of the federal government on. And this would be a perfect opportunity for them to very quickly tell people that whatever they want to do aspirationally over time, they have to recognize that trying to implement it in January of 2026 is unachievable. And all it will do is it'll hurt Doug Ford's auto industry in Ontario because they're not producing electric cars. It means that rather than buying the 10 cars that we do produce here, many of them hybrid, we'd be having to look at something else or not buying them at all. So this is not good for the country. It's not nation building. And I think it would be a pretty easy win for him to find some way of modifying that policy to send a signal that he gets the message.
After the election, we saw Mark Carney was pretty chummy with Donald Trump. And a lot of people sort of saw what he said during the campaign, that he was going to be elbows up, and then he was going to defend Canada against Donald Trump. And he really positioned himself as the person who's going to do that compared to Pierre Poilievre. Do you think he's followed through on that, or has he turned into more of a thumbs up instead of elbows up?
I'm the type of person who believes in diplomacy. What I find interesting is that I was criticized for taking that very same approach, and now that the Prime Minister is doing it, it's seen to be great statesmanship. So I would say that we always should have taken a diplomatic approach with the Americans. My approach has always been, because I understand a little bit about the character of the US president, because I covered him when I was in the mainstream media, he's not going to be persuaded by an argument of don't do this or it will hurt me, or do that to benefit me. That's not his framework. We have to talk about how our relationship benefits America and American companies and American economy and American energy dominance. That's the framework that I have been putting forward, and it was successful. We have zero tariffs on energy, zero tariffs on food, zero tariffs on most of the products coming out of Alberta. And that happens because when you engage and you talk to people from their area of and their perspective of interest, you can get a breakthrough. So I'm hoping that the Prime Minister may have learned that lesson too, and maybe we'll get a deal on the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement very soon. You've already seen that he did something that was so simple that the former Prime Minister refused to do, and that all the premiers were telling him to do. Commit to the 2% NATO target. We knew that if you didn't commit to the one thing that was so important to the Americans, then it's going to impact our trade. And I saw out of the NATO conference, the Prime Minister has said 5%, we're there. So I think that has already sent a signal that we're going to have a different relationship with not only the other allies that we have, but certainly with the United States.
And finally, I asked the question no premier wants to answer, not yet at least. If a clear independence referendum landed on the ballot, how would you vote?
So first off, I would say that the last week has shown us just how vitally important a bitumen pipeline is to the West Coast. When everyone's talking about, my goodness, what happens if Iran's supply gets disrupted? Well, we're right here. That's exactly the kind of oil that we can provide to our allies, which makes the absolute case that energy security and social and national security are tied. So I'd put that out there. Secondly, I would say that when I talk to the producers, they're very keen on getting more product to the U.S. We know that the American production is subsiding, and maybe there'll be new game-changing technology that will increase it. But at the moment, it looks like 13 million barrels a day is what they're producing. They consume 19 million barrels a day. They need to get it from someone. May as well get it from us. And so you've seen that the U.S. president has said that there is an interest in restarting something like the Keystone XL pipeline. So I know that there are already active conversations about getting more product moved south. I don't think that would be a good commentary on Canada. That's the whole reason why we're having this national conversation, is that we have so much trade ties north-south because we make it so difficult to do business east-west, but that's what I'd be prepared to do. I'd be prepared to continue working with our American counterparts on getting more product down south, and that would, I think, solve a lot of our problems. If we could get another 2 million barrels per day of production, that would be, at today's prices, about 40 billion per year in additional GDP. Of which governments take about 40% of that. You can solve a lot of problems if you have additional sources of revenue. So I think that there's always going to be Plan B. I would like to see all of the above options, but I also trust Albertans. If Albertans make the decision that they're frustrated to a point where they get enough signatures that they want to put a question to their fellow citizens, I've already committed that I'm prepared to put that to Albertans, and I'll let them decide.
Premier Smith says she wants to save Canada.
I still think my job is to try to save Canada.
But the frustration is real, and the clock is ticking.
Our difficulty right now is that we have to negotiate with British Columbia. If there was a separate Alberta, guess who we'd have to negotiate with? British Columbia. You still have the same factors and difficulties, regardless of whether you go it alone or not. And so I think that that's my job, is let's try to figure those problems out.
If Carney delays, if Ottawa deflects, and if Edmonton doesn't come up with solutions, Albertans might not wait around. Danielle Smith says she's going to let them decide. The only question left, will they choose Canada, or will they choose their own course?
How about you ask me in a year? If there is a petition campaign, if it is successful in getting the number of signatures, we'll have lots more to talk about. But in the meantime, I think my job is to advocate for a strong Alberta within a united Canada.
Thanks for your time, Premier.
You bet. Thanks, Kim.